Hello and welcome guys to the next raid guide in my series. This time we're tackling the 10th circle of Anabaseios. The boss this time is called Pandaemonium. The first mechanic that comes up will be our raid wide called Ultima. Ultima does pretty massive damage, but also has a very spicy dot that will last for 15 seconds. I highly recommend using at least 2 to 3 mitigations on this. You should have a reprisal on every single one of them, and then a feint or addle as well to accompany it. Next up, there's going to be a multi-hit tank buster. It's going to hit about 4 or 5 times, and you want to make sure that both tanks remain inside of the stack during the entire duration of this going off. Okay, so once the tank buster's done, Dividing Wings will then be casted. Dividing Wings will happen 3 times during this encounter, so it's important that you understand how this works the first time, as it'll make the later mechanics way easier. So first, 2 pylons are then going to spawn in static positions. The pylons will then tether to 2 random players. On the tethered players, they will receive a giant conal AoE that they must bait away from their teammates. For healers and tanks, it's worth noting that every person that gets these 2 tethers will get a massive dot, and if they don't get any sort of help, they will die. This may change later on when people's eye level goes up, but as of right now, this dot is very punishing. The same time this is going off, a mechanic called Steel Web is also being casted. 2 stack markers will appear, as well as a visible circle AoE around that stack. To do this mechanic, you'll have 2 players join in each stack marker, but making sure to not stand too close, because if you stand too close to the person with the stack marker, it will actually fail the mechanic and all 3 players will die. The way that you die actually forms a set of purple silk around all 3 of you that cannot be broken. But if you do the mechanic correctly, and you're stacked not too close, the silk can be broken. The players that bait the pylons will be the ones responsible for breaking the silk. I'll show this on a diagram as well. Now that the silk is dealt with, the boss is going to follow up with one of 2 mechanics. Circles of Pandaemonium or Pandaemon's Holy. Circles of Pandaemonium is a in mechanic, otherwise known as a dynamo. Pandaemon's Holy is an out mechanic, otherwise known as a chariot. So you either move into the boss's hitbox or just stay out until this attack is done with. It's worth noting that on Circles of Pandaemonium, the in safe area is actually not his entire hitbox, it's specifically the area around A, the waymarker, or just the northern side of this platform. After that, we'll be seeing a new tank buster. Wicked Step, being the next tank buster, does a couple unique things to this encounter. They are both tower mechanics, meaning that if a tank does not soak it, your party will wipe. But other than that, it will also fling the tank across the arena, meaning that in order for the tanks to survive, they need to stand on the intercardinal part of the tower that will fling them to the other side of the map. So for the tank on the left, he'll have to stand on the northeastern portion of his tower, whereas the tank on the right will have to stand on the northwestern portion of his tower. If the tanks don't do this, then unfortunately they will fall off the map. Once the tanks are secure on their new platforms, you should have 1 tank on the left platform, 1 tank on the right platform, and 6 players on the main platform. This is the setup you're going to need for Entangling Web, which is the next mechanic, as 4 AoEs will spawn on your team. 2 of them are always going to bait on your tanks, and the other 2 will be on 2 of the 6 players on the south platform. To resolve this mechanic, you're going to have to join the AoEs, meaning that the tanks are going to want to hug up against the little green sides while the players on the main platform are also going to want to tuck up against the green, so that way their AoE is overlapping with the tanks. Once they've overlapped their AoEs, they let it resolve, and then step out of the AoE. What this is going to do is build a bridge between these new platforms. Alright, so Pandaemoniac Pillars is probably one of the fastest mechanics I've ever seen in a Savage tier. It's not terribly difficult to learn, but don't be surprised if you get hit quite a few times while learning it, because it's quite repetitive and consistent, but you'll probably want to sprint it every time. I have never not sprinted this mechanic. That's how important it is. It can be done, obviously, that, you know, if you don't want to sprint this mechanic, that is perfectly fine, but always sprint pillars. That is my advice. Always sprint this mechanic. Now, what'll happen is 8 pillars are going to spawn around the arena. You will have a static position pillar. This will be your pillar through the entire fight. Don't forget it. Once things have resolved, all of them will disappear, and if a single person missed a tower, it will explode and kill the raid. Once the tower is done, pop sprint, and then the boss will then use Circles of Pandaemonium, which was the in mechanic from earlier, or he'll use Pandaemon's Holy once more, which is the out mechanic. So it's going to be in or out, and then determining which way you go is based on the 2 different constructs that form after the towers are gone. If chains form, you have to move away from those constructs. If a UFO orange-looking thing starts flying in the air, that is an in mechanic, or a donut AoE. You have to immediately move into the donut AoE that is also resolving the in or out mechanic from the boss. But we can break this down. Luckily, there's quite a bit of consistency with this mechanic, despite the speed in which it happens. What I personally do is I look for the dynamo or in mechanic that is against a wall. There will always be an in mechanic on the left or right side hugging the wall, and I immediately sprint into it. You have to always keep in mind that it is also an in or out mechanic with the boss at the same time. So if it's in, you know to be looking at the front row of structures, and if it's out, you know to be looking at the back row of structures. I've provided quite a few examples of me resolving this mechanic, so you can see how it goes. There is also an additional place to hide that I personally do not use, but it is more caster friendly if they don't want to move where I move. In the event that somebody soft fails this mechanic, when they soak their tower correctly, but they get clipped by one of the donut AoEs or the circle AoEs, they actually won't die. They'll receive a damage down for 30 seconds, take moderate damage, but receive a doom that can be Asuna'd that will last 5 seconds, so your healers have to be really quick about saving them. Okay, so Silkspit will then follow that mechanic. Silkspit is an 8-player spread. One thing to note about Silkspit is that if players are too close to one another, even if they're not overlapping with their AoEs, they will be tethered together and soft fail the mechanic. So you'll need to spread even more than is indicated. What I like to do, and this could change if people optimize this fight in the future, is put a melee and a tank on the left platform, a melee and a tank on the right platform, and finally the healers and range will remain on the main platform and spread on cardinals. Okay, so as Silk is resolving, Daemoniac Bonds is an attack that will happen several times throughout this fight, at least like 5 or 6, depending on how fast your group kills the boss. What it does is applies a few different potential debuffs on your bar. Before we dive into those debuffs, we'll talk about them later, and we're going to worry about another mechanic for now. Just don't forget that those debuffs are there. The first mechanic that's going to happen is Pandaemoniac Meltdown is going to cause a line stack AoE to pick a random player. 6 players need to soak this, and you'll want to use a fair amount of mitigation on it as it does hurt. Also shield it. At the same time, 2 different players are going to get targeted for line AoEs that will apply a vuln. Alright, so once the 2 line AoEs and the line stack finish, the boss is going to use touchdown, forcing everybody off the main platform. It is at this point the previously mentioned demoniac mechanic will now come into play. When that initially put debuffs on everybody, everyone is going to have 2 mechanics to do, with a timer on them. Whichever one elapses first is the one that you're going to have to solve first. And we're going to break both of them down right now. There's 3 potential debuffs that you'll get. One of them being a solo spread marker. One of them being a pair soaking mechanic. And finally, one of them will be a 4-man stack. A few things to note is that regarding the 4-man stack, one of them will always pick a support, and one of them will always pick a DPS. Conversely, with the pair mechanic, all 4 roles will always receive the pair mechanic. Meaning, if all 4 DPS get it, they cannot choose each other as pair mates. What that means is if you get the pair version of this mechanic, you must have a light party go to the left platform, meaning a tank, a healer, and 2 DPS. And on the right side, you'll have a tank, a healer, and 2 DPS. That way, whoever got the pair mechanic, let's say supports, a support stacks with a DPS, and then the other support will stack with the other DPS. The reason why I'm breaking this down is because in the other version of the mechanic, where there is a 4-man stack, one person in each party will get the debuff. You will never see 2 DPS get the 4-man stack. And conversely, you'll never see 2 supports get the 4-man stack. What that means is if it's the 4-man stack variant of the mechanic, you do not do light party spreads. You will do role spreads. Understanding the difference between a light party spread and a role spread is pretty important for several mechanics going forward. Let's do this one at a time. Let's start with pairs and solo spreads. If the first debuff you have that goes off is the solo spread, you and your group will go to the left platform or right platform and spread. Next, you will have a partner that you will pair up with and soak the AoE. On the left, it's usually the tank and the melee, as well as the ranged DPS and the healer. The same thing will happen on the right. Note, it is very possible for the pair mechanic to resolve first, meaning you'll start paired with your buddy and then quickly spread afterward. In the other variation, which is also visible on this diagram, is when it is role spreads, meaning that each player has a spread debuff, as well as a 4-man stack debuff within their party. So, the 4 DPS will go to the left platform in this case, and then either spread or stack. And on the right side, the 2 tanks and 2 healers will then spread or stack, based on whichever one is first. It's worth mentioning that in the stack mechanic and the spreads, they don't do too much damage, so even though there's not a healer on the other side, the party will survive. Regardless of which variation you get, you'll prog both of these variations quite a bit during your duration on this time of the fight. Once this mechanic is done, you'll make your way back to the center. So you probably want to throw some mitigations on the boss while you're running in, as he is now casting Ultima, that hard-hitting raid wide that has a big bleed on it. Once everyone's sufficiently topped up, he will follow up with yet another tank buster called Soul Grasp. Both tanks wanting to be inside of this, popping mitigation, and staying inside of the buster for the entirety of all blasts. I believe there's 4 of them. Once the buster is done, he's going to move into the new part of this phase that leads with Daemoniac Bonds once more, putting more timer debuffs that we're going to worry about a little later. Before we worry about the Daemoniac Bonds, we have Pandaemoniac turrets that are spawning, in 8 static positions, 4 of them being on the north side of the platform, and 4 of them being on the south. I recommend you put your 2 melees and 2 tanks up front, and you have your 4 ranged in the back, soaking those towers. Of course, if you missed one of these towers, it will blow up and wipe the raid, so make sure you're standing in it. These towers serve as a means to spawn in these little cart-like creatures that will spawn in the place of the towers. They will be numbered 1 to 4, with 2 of them of each number. 2 number 1s, 2 number 2s, 2 number 3s, and 2 number 4s. Okay, so before we go into this, I did want to give another reminder that this mechanic is probably the one that is the least optimized in our group and will likely be replaced in the future by something more efficient. But seeing that it's week 1, I wanted to still show how we got the clear and how we resolved things, just in case other people are trying to get through this as fast as possible. So, first I'll explain what they do. The 4 numbered carts, as I call them, will drive down their lanes based on wherever the nearest person is baiting them. So if you walk up to one, it will attach to you almost and drive straight at you, meaning you can point it and aim it wherever you want it. 1s will go off first, 2s, 3s, then 4s. The person who is the closest to the cart will receive a vuln, meaning they cannot get hit by another one. But if they have someone else with them, that person who is behind you will not receive the vuln. If you take it alone, you will die, unless you're a tank. So what we do is we have our melee DPS stand in front of the 1 carts, and the tank will go right behind them. After a moment, the carts will dash forward, giving vulnerabilities to the 2 melee, and the tanks are free to take another cart. Our healers are standing in front of the 2 carts, meaning when theirs go off, the healers will now have a vuln and cannot take another cart, whereas the tanks standing behind them did not get a vuln and are free to take the 3rd cart. Finally, the magical DPS are standing in front of carts 3. The process repeats, except this time we aimed our 3 carts at the 4 carts, so that way there was more time for the tanks to quickly adjust and make sure they're there. Because no one else is going to soak the carts with the tanks, they will solo soak them for the final variation. Once all of the carts are done, you will then have to finally revisit the mechanic, Daemoniac, as your timers will now be about to expire. This time, it'll either be a spread into pairs, or a pairs into spread. You can use your preset positions for this, like you did in the previous mechanic. Once the pairs and spreads are over and done with, the boss is going to use Pandaemoniac Ray, which will cut off half of the main platform, meaning the team has to hide on the other side of this half. Anytime Pandaemoniac Ray goes off within the Savage version of this encounter, a large amount of bits will spawn vertically on the arena, shooting laser beams through the entire platform. Once the ray goes off, it is important to immediately reposition to make sure you don't get clipped by one of these bits. With the bits gone, the boss will then use another Ultima raid-wide, which you want to mitigate pretty heavily because, as mentioned before, it does have a very spicy and long duration damage over time. After Ultima, another Soul Grasp, tank busting your tanks 4 times in a shared buster. Like before, another tank buster will happen, Wicked Step. The same process of the tanks being knocked to their respective platforms will repeat. Like before, Silkspit will put a circle AoE on every single player in the raid, and you're going to want to make sure that you're not too close to anybody. Again, even if your AoEs are not overlapping on Silkspit, it is very possible to be too close to somebody, as you will tether to one another, and the mechanic will fail. Another thing of note is that the yellow-looking pylons near the bridges also serve as players in this regard, so you cannot stand too close to them, or the mechanic will fail. As Silkspit is resolving, I highly, highly, highly recommend you do not sprint. The reason why is I like to save sprint, because the next mechanic after this is that tower mechanic from earlier that I always use sprint on. Obviously, this is up to you and your own preference, but that's my suggestion. Now that the towers are resolved, the boss will begin cleaving either the west or east side of the arena. Your Daemoniac Bonds are also about to resolve in your roll groups. You will either have to spread first and then stack, or stack first and then spread. It is worth noting that after your first Daemoniac Bond resolves, bits will then spawn, and you have to account for their spacing when doing the second dodge. If more than 2 or 3 people die to this mechanic, I highly, highly, highly recommend using your healer limit break 3 to ensure that the next mechanic resolves cleanly. Okay, so earlier we talked about dividing wings. This will be the second time dividing wings comes up. This time, the beacon taking place on the south side of the left and right platforms. Like before, steel web will be casted once more, and finally, 1 player tethered to each beacon. Our group did rolls for this, with DPS leaning the left platform and supports leaning the right platform. It's worth mentioning though that you could get tethered to either beacon, so no matter which beacon you get tethered to, you simply go to that beacon and stand on the south side of it, while the stack stands on the north side of the beacon. Once you've baited the beacon, you run up and quickly free your friends by snapping all of the silks between them. Also, like before, the players who get the baited tethers will experience massive single target damage over time, so make sure your tanks and healers are paying attention, because they will die if they don't get help. Once the stack and beacon are resolved, both parties of 4 can collapse back to middle, where another Pandaemoniac meltdown will be happening. And after that, another Soul Grasp tank buster will follow suit. The boss is just gonna chill for a little while, but after about 10 seconds, he'll use Dividing Wings for the third and final time, placing 2 beacons in the center just like at the start of the fight. This time, Pandaemoniac Web is going to spawn on 3 players. Those 3 players have the same AoE that you've been using to make the bridge this entire fight. Using the markers in the fight, we have them set in such a way to make this part of the mechanic a lot easier. Basically, what needs to happen is the 3 players with Pandaemoniac Web need to stand on the south, southwest, and southeast portion of the main platform. What this will accomplish is building a giant gate of sorts, or barrier, at the back of the arena. This can only be accomplished if all 3 AoEs are touching and combined. At the same time, 2 players are going to be tethered to those 2 beacons, and they should point them out east and west respectively. The east beacon baits at east, the west beacon baits at west. The final 3 players will either get a stack marker or nothing. The stack marker simply hides behind said beacons, while the 2 players soak the stack marker with them, meaning that they will be stuck together with silk, just like in all the previous mechanics. Once the first round of attacks goes off, the 3 spreads in the back, the stack, and the 2 beacons, the 3 players that are now silked in the middle need to be freed. Because once those 3 players are freed, they can then go to the south part of the platform and build another gate by standing on the markers in the south side of the platform. This will strengthen the gate that is already there and make it even larger, to the point where it will now serve as a wall. This is absolutely imperative in order for the next mechanic to succeed. If this fails, unfortunately, the boss will one-shot you automatically. Another thing that's worth noting is if a player walks into the silk rope or gate that is formed in the south side of the arena before it has been strengthened by the second set of spreads, then it will break and fail the mechanic instantly. Now, once this all resolves, the hardest mitigation and healing check of the fight will occur. I recommend you set aside both tank invulns, Reprisal, Feint, Addle, as well as your physical range mitigation in order to survive this. My static used Limit Break 3 for this. The tank Limit Break 3, I should say. Before he casts Harrowing Hell, he will put timed debuffs on you once more, but we can ignore those for now. Harrowing Hell is a massive raid wide that continues to pound away at your static for the next 15 seconds and follows up with a massive knockback. If you did not successfully build the gate in the south side of the arena, this will automatically fail. Another thing to note is that the front two players will be taking Tank Buster level damage the entire 15 seconds, meaning if you stand in front of the tanks here, you will instantly be one shot. So both tanks should pop their mitigations and move to the front, and then eventually pop their invulnerabilities once it gets too much to bear. But even when we didn't limit break, we were losing people quite frequently, so do not slouch the mid on this. It's also worth noting that Magic Barrier on Red Mage does not work to mitigate the damage, but will help the healing. Feint is also kind of mandatory here, in addition to Reprisal, because it is physical damage. After the 15 seconds have elapsed, you will be knocked back into the southern barrier that you've created. And at this point, you will have one more spread or pairs to resolve, based on which timers you got. There's a little bit of leeway with the timing on this, so as soon as you get knocked back, go ahead and do your spreads or pairs based on whichever one is first, and then perform the other once that is done. Give yourself a pat on the back, as the worst of the fight is now behind you. To start things off, you're going to have an Ultima raid wide. You might be a little low on mitigations at this point due to the battering you just received on the previous mechanic, so make sure you're doing extra heals here if needed. Your tanks are going to be hit by 2 back-to-back tank busters at this point, and they might also be low on mitigations, so make sure you're giving them extra heals here if needed. The first tank buster will be Soul Grasp, the multi-hit tank buster. And then pretty quickly after that, they're going to be hit by yet another Wicked Step. Once they've been knocked to their new platforms, the party will once again have to deal with Entangling Web, where they will reform the bridges just like they've done earlier. Once the bridges are formed, the tanks are going to want to return to the main platform as we have the final new mechanic of the fight. The final new mechanic is called Parted Plumes. If you have done the normal mode, you've already seen this before, and luckily there isn't really any major changes made to it. You start next to the spot where it begins and step into it. Alternatively, you could chase the Parted Plumes around the arena. Regardless, you want to make sure that you end up on the side that the gaze is not looking at. You can pop Sprint to make this mechanic a little safer, but note that once the gaze goes off, for the third time in this fight, bits will spawn, and you'll want to make sure that you align yourself that you won't get clipped by them. And finally, the boss will use Circle of Pandaemonium, or Pandaemon's Holy once more. Once the bits are resolved, every single player will then receive another spread marker from Silkspit. Once you're in your spread positions, which was melees and tanks on the left and right platforms, and you're ranged on the middle platform, you will have the tower mechanic to resolve once again. And once the towers are resolved, you will have to do in or out, just as you did earlier in the fight. Once that's over, the boss will then repeat the mechanic of the 6-player stack, and then the 2 spread markers who do not want to be inside of the stack. It is at this point that the boss's soft enrage will now begin. The audio cue, "Your punishment shall be unending," will go, and he'll use Harrowing Hell once more. This time you have no way of escape through the means of the gate in the south, and he will repeatedly hit your party with physical damage. Dump every last scrap of mitt you have and heals, and hope that you kill him before the hard enrage, where he punts you off. That is every mechanic in the fight, and I hope this was a useful guide for you. And I really thank and appreciate everyone who gave feedback and criticisms on the previous guide, and I hope that this one was better than the last one. As a closing note, I'm going to go ahead and recommend our Day 2 Clear VOD, which is uploaded on YouTube. It has callouts as well as all of the strategies used in this video, So that way, if you do end up using any of these strategies to study from, you'll have a tangible example to use. In the following day or two, we will also be uploading the P10S guide, so stay tuned for that, and feel free to drop a sub and like and whatnot if you had a good time. I also stream full-time at twitch.tv/AhriEffect if anyone is interested. Y'all have a good day, and good luck with your clears. Later.